Good evening.
Recorded, not in his voice, but he's written.
My name is Vaughan Smith, and I'd like to welcome you very sincerely to the Frontline Club for our awards. As we all know, it's been a challenging, particularly interesting year in news gathering this year. And I think you'll find, I hope that you find, that the content we have for you tonight reflects that. However, I'm not going to spend much time talking because there's quite a lot to get through. But I do have to, and very pleased to do so. We are supported by Vodafone, Canon, and Chivas Regal. And Chivas are providing the drinks that we're all getting for free. Vodafone, we wouldn't be doing it without Vodafone, and Canon providing some of the prizes. So I'd just like to express on behalf of us all our appreciation. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing it.
You need a camera, you need a phone, and you've definitely got to get drunk.
Your membership revenue wouldn't cover this, you see. Though, should some of you subscribe, that might. Also, again, the other person, or the person that has actually done all the hard work to make this happen, of course, is Millie, who will wave her hand at you there. I have done absolutely nothing to make this happen. Millie has done absolutely everything, so thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Jon Snow, for coming. 13 minutes, apparently, it took him to bicycle over here from Channel 4, which is, I think, hastily. He was so excited to come here, clearly. But I'm very grateful for Jon for doing that. And now we are going to start and get straight into it. And I'm just going to introduce Sue Turton, who's going to come up here to say something. But very important to understand the conditions that you're able to hear this, and I'm sure Sue will explain.
Good evening. I'm here to give the keynote speech this evening, which was written by Peter Grester, one of my colleagues from Al Jazeera, who is, I'm sure, as you all know, incarcerated in Egypt after a trial early this year. Just a little bit about the method as to how we got this speech. Peter's only allowed to smuggle 2 letters out a month. So he couldn't write the speech and hand it to us. Basically, he had to dictate it to his family members who visit him once a fortnight. So it's been quite arduous, really, putting a speech together. I'm sure we can all appreciate how important it is to get his words out. Just to add that if the authorities thought he'd smuggled the speech out, then his privileges would have been taken away. So anybody sort of relays how we got this speech, it's very important you say that. And the other thing I just wanted to mention before I deliver the speech is a number. And that number is 292. And that's how many days he's now been in prison, along with Mohammed Fahmy and Baha Mohammed. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight is, I know, a moment to celebrate the very best of our craft, to honour those whose work represents the standards and values, the admiration and respect, not just of our peers, but also the public, and that we can all point to in arguments about why our industry really is essential to a proper functioning democracy. But this evening's gathering also comes after the horrific execution of James Foley and Stephen Sotloff by the Islamic State in Syria. And so before I talk about the awards, I'd like to take the opportunity to pay my respects to them and reflect on the state of journalism more broadly. Both James and Stephen paid the ultimate price for working in an industry increasingly reliant on brave, committed freelancers. They occupied a space where risk-averse news organisations are increasingly outsourcing coverage itself. Of course, the extremists who murdered them weren't concerned about who they worked for. What mattered was that they were journalists and they were Westerners. And in those respects, they represent a shocking example of a broader state of affairs faced by thousands of journalists around the world. Rarely have so many of us been imprisoned, beaten up, intimidated or murdered in the course of our duties. In my cell in Masra prison in Cairo, I don't have access to the latest figures, but an editorial in the Times that I saw quotes the sums that Freedom House put together for last year. In 2013, 71 journalists were killed on the job. 826 were arrested, 2,160 were physically attacked, and 87 were kidnapped. And those numbers don't include the fixers who are often more exposed than us, the reporters who hire them, or the citizen journalists who are often the only source of information in places like Syria. Heaven only knows what the numbers are this year, with Syria, Iraq, Gaza, and Ukraine helping to drive them north. As of May this year, more than 60 reporters had died in Syria alone, and more than 30 had been kidnapped. And that's before the killing of James and Stephen. Globally, Freedom House says that press freedom is the worst it's been in a decade. It reckons that 44% of the world's population lives in places where the media is ranked as not free, while 42% are in regions where the media is said to be only partly free. A few years ago, Barack Obama addressed a special joint sitting of Australia's Parliament, and in his typically grand sweeping style, he declared that the currents of history ebb and flow, but over time they move decisively in a single direction. History, he said, is on the side of the free. Free societies, free governments, free economies, free people. But if that is true, why are times so tough for those of us working at the sharp end of the fourth estate? After all, our industry is supposed to underpin that inexorable march towards liberty and democracy. I don't know of any politician who openly declares that the world would be better off if a meek and compliant press were there, and yet the disturbing figures tell a different story. I may not have an academically researched hypothesis, but as you'll appreciate, I've had a bit of free time to think about this. It seems to me that at least part of the problem is the changing nature of conflict itself, and the fact that it's driven by the atrociously named war on terror. The name itself, I think, goes a long way towards explaining why we are in this situation. Throughout most of the past 4 decades, wars have been dominated by struggles over tangible things like territory or resources or ethnicity. Even some of the conflicts over competing political ideologies, such as Colombia's civil war between leftist rebels and a right-wing government, were in truth struggles for control of land. Those of us who've covered that messy, complex conflict, or other wars like the battle for resources in eastern Congo, or political and ethnic power in South Sudan, will know that the biggest risk comes from random bits of metal flying around, or a drunk soldier at a checkpoint, rather than an attack aimed specifically at journalists. It's risky, of course, but the dangers are usually incidental, from working in an inherently violent environment rather than in a place particularly hostile to journalists. Even in the early days of the Arab Spring, when I'd argue that the fighting was over one of the most valuable resources of all, political power, journalists were rarely directly attacked. And plenty of news organisations were able to place teams on both sides of the lines and cover the crisis with a degree of balance and neutrality. Of course, propaganda is as old as war itself, and warring factions have always sought to control the narrative of a conflict. But in these wars over stuff, the target has generally been the message rather than the messenger. But this brings me back to the war on terror. A conflict by its very nature is indefinable, with no clear physical or ideological boundaries, and with a title that means everything and nothing. Or rather, it means whatever any of the groups involved want it to mean. This is, in a way, what we've rarely seen in the past, a struggle over ideas and ideologies. It's a battle between competing worldviews, much more than a fight for land or minerals. And in this struggle, the message is as much a weapon as any gun. Witness the way Islamic State has used YouTube to recruit its supporters and terrify its opponents. The trouble for us journalists is that there is no neutral turf, no safe ground for which to report. As much as we abhor and condemn the executions of James and Stephen, it was George Bush who set the ground rules in the wake of 9/11, when he declared that you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. That single statement made it impossible for reporters to hold to the principles of balance and fairness without being accused of acting as an agent for the enemy. Al Jazeera learned that to its cost when the US hit its offices in Baghdad during the invasion to oust Saddam. And in Afghanistan, when one of its cameramen, Sami al-Hajj, was arrested. He spent 7 years in Guantanamo Bay before being released without charge. Since the war on terror began, all manner of abuse of journalists and attacks on human rights and press freedoms have been excused as necessary evils. And by governments across the globe, it almost feels like a kind of globalized McCarthyism, where simply invoking terrorism is enough, in some cases, to get away with murder. I don't mean to minimise the risk of terrorism or blame the governments alone. The Islamic State's executions are simply the latest and most shocking examples of the problem on one side of the ledger. The roll call of victims is sobering indeed. From my old friend Maria Garcia Gotulli, an Italian magazine writer, and the group of freelance and agency journalists she was travelling with, who were among the first to be murdered by the Taliban in Afghanistan after 9/11, to the Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl, to the BBC's Simon Cumbers, gunned down in Saudi Arabia, and Frank Gardner, who survived the attack, to another BBC friend and colleague, Kate Payton, killed in a drive-by shooting in Mogadishu, and the Channel 4 News cameraman, Martin Adler, who died there the following year, and onto the latest victims. These are just some of the more high-profile casualties of the conflict. And in this relatively small community, I'm willing to bet that only a handful of people here tonight have more than 1 or 2 degrees of separation between themselves and someone who's been killed, wounded, or imprisoned. We all know someone or know someone who knew one of them. My point is that in all of these battlegrounds, whether hot or cold, journalists are no longer on the front lines, we are the front lines. In this wider conflict, there is no such thing as a neutral, independent reporter. In the view of both sides, if you cross the lines in pursuit of one of our most fundamental principles of balance or fairness or accuracy, you effectively join the enemy. The compelling worldviews seem so widely divergent that to even try to understand the other side is to commit what many governments now consider to be treason. So where does this leave the future? Well, I don't think it's hopeless. At a personal level, our incarceration in Egypt, myself and my 2 Al Jazeera colleagues, Mohammed Fahmy and Baha Mohammed, are more crucial, and more crucially, the Foley and Sotloff murders have dramatically reminded people why a free and untrammeled press is so important. People might not always like everything they see in the media, but they recognize the intrinsic value of ethical, professional reporting and instinctively balk at anything that limits it. I've been staggered by the incredible number of people who've supported our cause, not so much because they see an injustice, but because they see an attack on press freedom. In one of the letters that made it through the prison gates, one woman wrote to gleefully remind me of those surveys where they often ranked the journalist's social status as somewhere between a used car salesman and an abattoir worker. But then she went on to write, I also know that fearless and frank journalism as practiced by true professionals is what keeps our treasured democracy so strong. The key phrase here is true professionals. People recognise shabby, partisan journalism when they see it, but at times of crisis, they still turn on the news or go to the websites of their most trusted news organisations. The hunger for reliable news and the recognition of the role it plays in a healthy, functioning democracy is still there, but we can't take public support for granted. That's why I'm convinced that our best strategy as an industry starts with a rock-solid commitment to our core ethical and professional standards. The more sloppy we get, the more we degrade public support for our business, the more excuses we give to governments to limit and control what we do. This is far more than an abstract idea. This is very much about our own security as individual journalists. Take our case as an example. I'm incredibly proud and humbled by the extraordinary wave of support that we've been getting from around the world, from human rights groups, from politicians and diplomats, but also crucially from a huge chunk of the public as well. As I said, much of what has been in response to the principles they've seen violated, but I'm also convinced that if any of us had a stained professional reputation, our accusers would have hailed it from the rooftops, and our support would have crumbled to dust. Our political champions would have walked away and we'd be seen as victims of our own shabby standards. We are still in prison, of course, but I'm still certain that if and when we are finally released, that global support will be what ultimately saves us. There is also one other source of backing that I want to spend a few moments on that has been both crucial and I suspect somewhat unprecedented. Even at the very best of times, we journalists are a fractious bunch. We are argumentative, sceptical, and fiercely competitive. I suppose those are the qualities that drove most of us into this business in the first place. But there are also traits that make us notoriously hard to organise. And yet, it feels as though our entire community has set aside its instincts and swung behind us in a solid, unified block. We've seen letters co-signed by fierce rivals. The Zip Lips campaign, which has seen our colleagues from around the world post selfies with their mouths taped shut, including, I'm sure, more than a few people in this room. There have been persistent questions in news conferences, notes of support to us in prison, and of protests to the authorities. In short, there's been a unity of purpose that not only inspires and strengthens us, but I believe sends a powerful message to any politician considering a clampdown on the press. Taken together, this outpouring of political and public support has helped reignite a crucial debate about the relationship between governments and the media, or more correctly, between a free press and a free society. Whether people are aware of it or not, I'd like to think that most would agree with Albert Camus, who said that a free press can of course be both good and bad, but most certainly without freedom, the press will never be anything but bad. Ladies and gentlemen, I've not had an opportunity to see any of the entries for tonight's awards, but I know that to have made the shortlist, the work you will see will, by any definition, be amongst the best independent journalists can deliver. I know that without seeing it, that it will be courageous, revealing, and inspired. I also know that it will be the kind of work that reminds our readers and audiences why a free press really does matter. Thank you.
Friends, journalism is not a crime. And let that cry continue to go out until Peter and his two colleagues are freed. Vaughan spoke of challenging times. They are extreme times. There are two enormous issues unfolding in front of us right now, Ebola and Islamic states, both of which are almost impenetrable for any but the most committed and almost extreme journalists. It's terribly difficult to get to Ebola areas without enormous personal risk, and many, understandably, particularly those with children, it's an enormous challenge. And Islamic states, pretty challenging too, enormously challenging. And these are the circumstances in which tonight we have a series of awards which are the very best of the best. They really are remarkable. And we're going to start with the broadcast shortlist. Nominated first, Safa Al-Ahmad, and he's nominated for Saudi's Secret Uprising, BBC Our World, BBC Arabic, and BBC Persian channels. Safa Al-Ahmad is a Middle East-based Saudi freelance journalist working in print, television, and documentary. In Saudi Arabia's oil-rich eastern province, a 3-year uprising is still ongoing. Safa Al-Ahmad gained unprecedented access to the activists at the epicenter in the coastal region of Qatif. The judges said working in eastern Saudi Arabia is difficult, and the filmmaker put together a comprehensive picture of what's been happening.
These are the trademark images of Saudi Arabia. Peaceful and prosperous. A royal family in control. And this is what you don't see. People are taking to the streets to fight against what they see as oppression.
Our second nominee in the broadcast shortlist, Median Dehrieh, nominated for the Islamic State Vice News. Median Dehrieh is an award-winning freelance filmmaker with over 15 years' experience documenting conflicts across the Middle East from Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and Syria. He spent 3 weeks embedded with the Islamic State, gaining unprecedented access to the group in Iraq and in Syria. The judges said, "The report has extraordinary access. We haven't seen anything like this. The filmmaker takes the audience into a dangerous and unseen world and gives us a visual and human context for the larger debate around IS."
هذا هو مكان قناص. لسه ما بينت معكم كثيرا.
لابد نحن المسلمين، نحن الذين نريد أن نقيم شرع الله في هذه الأرض. والله الذي لا إله إلا هو، لا يقام شرع الله إلا بالسلاح، إلا بالسلاح.
أحب أن أصير بدولة الإسلام في العراق والشام وأقاتل معهم لأنهم يحبون أن يقاتلون المرتدين والكفراء.
The third nominated entry in the broadcast shortlist, Marcel Mettelsven, nominated for Dispatches, Children on the Frontline, ITN Productions for Channel 4. Marcel is a photojournalist, documentary filmmaker, and co-publisher of Zenith, a special interest magazine about the Middle East. Dispatches, Children on the Frontline, tells the story of 5 young children whose lives have been changed forever by the war in Syria. The judges said he found unforgettable characters, and bravely he allowed the camera to be still to capture the emotional roller coaster of life on the front line from a child's point of view.
The children of Syria are paying a terrible price for the war that their parents are fighting. Thousands have been killed, and over 1 million are now refugees. These children are forced to behave like adults, to abandon their innocence and adapt to a new way of life. They have now become a generation defined by conflict.
So now the winner in the traditional form within this envelope, and I genuinely have no idea which of these 3 remarkable journalists. The winner is Median Derer. Congratulations, Median. Median, a few words.
First of all, thank you for coming today. I would like to thank my lovely teams. They work very hard all the times, even weekends. And the big thing, really, they was very worried about me about more than 3 weeks. They haven't heard anything from me. When I sent the first message, and they knew everything after that. Actually, I would like to say one word to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. It's really, they was very good with me, and we need one thing from Islamic State to release all the hostage immediately. And thank you very much.
And we're grateful to Al Jazeera, who I'm hoping recorded that message. And if they didn't, Mehdi's going to say it again for you, for those of you who didn't hear it, and let's hope the world hears it. Now we're on to the print shortlist, and the nominations are as follows. David Smith, nominated for Unspeakable Horrors in a Country on the Verge of Genocide, The Guardian. The unfolding horrors in the Central African Republic, where Christian and Muslim militias were locked in fighting and gained little worldwide attention. Africa correspondent for The Guardian, David Smith, set out to show the importance of this story. The judges said this story alerted people at an early stage to the horrors that are going on in the Central African Republic. A brave and flawless performance. He writes urgently and grippingly of a little-known conflict in an excellent example of foreign reporting. Here's an extract. A massacre of the innocents is taking place in the heart of Africa as the world looks the other way. One man describes how his 4-year-old son's throat was slit and how he saw a snake swallowing a baby. A woman explains that she's caring for a young girl because her mother went searching for medicine and was bludgeoned to death with Kalashnikov rifles. A young man tells how he was bound and thrown to the crocodiles but managed to swim to safety. This is the world of horrors that the Central African Republic has become. Our second print nomination is Rania Abu Zaid, nominated for the Jihad Next Door Politico. Rania Abu Zaid is a Lebanese-Australian journalist who has covered the Middle East and Pakistan for well over a decade. The Jihad Next Door was reported on several trips into northern Syria this year with Al-Qaeda's official branch in the country, Jabhat al-Nusra. The judges said, deeply Freudian slip, the judges said a rare achievement and dangerous assignment that involved returning to interview commanders 3 times, sometimes something that few others have dared or been able to match. It is a real breakthrough that she was able to interview members of the group and relate its recent history despite the extreme danger in doing so. Here's an extract. The 8 men, beards trimmed, explosive belts fastened, pistols and grenades concealed in their clothing, waited until nightfall before stealing across the flat, porous Iraqi border. They navigated the burns and trenches along the frontier, traversing 2-way smuggling routes used to ferry cigarettes, livestock, weapons, and jihads to enter the northeastern Syrian province of Hasaka. It was August 2011, the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, and Syria was 5 months into a still largely peaceful uprising against President Bashar al-Assad. Our third entry, Iona Craig, nominated for What Really Happened When a US Drone Hit a Yemeni Wedding Convoy. Al Jazeera, America. Iona Craig is an independent journalist based in Sana'a, Yemen, where she's been working as the Times Yemen correspondent since 2010. She's covered America's covert war in Yemen for 4 years. For her investigation into a US drone attack that left 12 civilians dead, she travelled undercover to the strike site 6 days after the bombing of a wedding convoy in remote central Yemen. The judges said, a story that it takes courage and careful preparation to report, given the danger of kidnapping in Yemen. But it is important that people on the ground verify who is being hit by drones. Otherwise, the story is left to propagandists. Iona Craig has done this convincingly in the sort of story that only a reporter who knows a country well can do. Well, those are our 3 nominations in the print category. It's now my pleasure to open the envelope. And I'm delighted to say that this year the judges were unable to decide between 2 pieces, so we have 2 winners. We have the pleasure of 2 brilliant women, Rania Abu Zaid and Iona Craig. Congratulations.
For this story, the particular importance actually is to the Yemenis who I travelled with. There was a small group of human rights activists in Yemen who have dedicated essentially their lives to reporting on America's covert war in Yemen. And there are always anecdotal stories behind what journalists do in these kind of cases, but we were stuck on the way back from having been to the village where this drone strike had happened and been to the site. In the process of that, we were tracked actually by a US drone for the whole time that we were there. But on our return, we were stuck overnight in the town of Radar because of fighting as a direct result of this drone strike. There were local tribes and Al-Qaeda who were fighting the military because of what had happened. We were then forced to stay the night in this town. Now, the Yemenis that I were traveling with, if they'd been caught with me, they would have been arrested, and I, at worst, would have been deported. But they certainly would have been thrown in prison. The two women, the Yemeni women that also travelled with me, if they'd been found out, they were travelling with other Yemeni men who were not their family members, and they would have been shamed because of that. But they continue to, every time there is a drone strike, do their best to follow up exactly what's happening on the ground. So even though I was able to get there on this occasion, they are consistently carrying out this work. One of them, as a result, has been forced to flee the country and is outside Yemen at the moment for her own safety. So it's really for them that these kind of stories become possible. Without them, I wouldn't have been able to get there, and I wouldn't have been able to get back. And my lasting memory of actually reporting on the story was also the children that I met. I met 17 children who lost their fathers in that strike, and that was only a handful of the men. It was an incredibly poor area where they came from, and I will certainly never forget the child victims as a result of that strike.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this award. I'm thrilled to share it with Iona, whose work I respect deeply. It wasn't easy to report this story. As you can imagine, it's not easy to talk with Al-Qaeda, and it's a little bit harder to do as a woman. I reported this story in 3 trips to northern Syria this year with Jabhat al-Nusra in the middle of what became an inter-jihadi war between Islamic State on one side, the Syrian rebels, and Jabhat al-Nusra. It has been my great privilege, my great honor to cover Syria. For 3 years, I was in Damascus in February 2011 during the first protests, and I have entered the country clandestinely many times since then. And I have watched I wouldn't say evolution, I'd say the devolution of an uprising that began with peaceful protests and has morphed into a brutal, not merely civil war, but regional conflagration that is drawing in the West and other international states. But I just want to say that Syria is more than the Islamic State. Syria is more than Al-Qaeda. Syria is the people. And I think that sometimes in this rush to report about ISIS, or ISIL, or whatever you want to call them, that is sometimes forgotten. But more than 200,000 people have lost their lives in the span of a few years. And I think that we as journalists owe it to them, and we owe it to our profession, to continue reporting on what is one of the most pivotal states in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
And while they're taking their seats, I made an omission. I failed to give you your certificates. Medyu, can you come back? Seeing as we're still on iOS. So congratulations. Where's that photograph? There we go, look. There we go, the man over there. Just over there. Great. Thanks very much. So now we move on to the photojournalism shortlist. And the first of our nominees tonight is Eric Bouvet, nominated for Heroes from Maidan, The Eye of Photography, and Paris Match. Eric Bouvet has been a practicing photojournalist since 1981. His work covers 20th of February 2014, a day that changed Ukraine in the bloodiest day since the unrest began in Kiev. More than 70 people were killed in Maidan. The judges said this is extremely well-executed war photography, displaying significant presence of mind and an ability to maintain judgment and control under direct sniper fire. It is a rare example of the convergence of exceptional journalism, exceptional photographic ability, and exceptional courage. One picture tells 1,000 words, and so many more than that. Our second nominee for the photojournalism shortlist, Oliver Wakin, nominated for his work in Gaza, European Press Photo Agency. EPA photographer Oliver Wakin covered the Gaza side of the conflict, more precisely the Palestinian victims. Some 2,000 Gazans were killed, including some 500 children, and another 10,000 were wounded. The judges said extremely well executed with several very, very powerful frames. Great, great work, very careful observation, and tremendous use of light and colour. And our third nomination in this category is Mohammed Seba, nominated for his work on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, European Press Photo Agency. Mohammed Seba is EPA's chief photographer in Gaza. He's followed the conflicts for many years, this year in particular, with the intensified fighting after the kidnapping and murder of 3 Israeli teenagers. He documented the Israeli shelling and the victims. The judges said, very explosive, extremely courageous work, terrific and sustained daily news coverage, lots of imagination in composition, one of the toughest stories to cover this year. That concludes our shortlist, and the winner, turning to the photograph, to the envelope, here we go. And the winner is Eric Bouvet.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.
Là-bas.
Okay, you will translate. You can translate?
C'est pas possible.
Oh. So I will do it shortly because it's my awful English. I'm sorry, everybody. I will try to save your hairs if I'm short. Okay. First of all, I'm very proud, but very, very proud to be here because I remember when I was a young photographer during the early 80s, the only way to have some news when we are in deep Afghanistan or far away in Chechnya, all over, the only way to have some news was the short waves radio, and I was listening the English radio. And still, and even after, and still now, when I'm in a hotel or the TV, I'm looking the English news because I think they are the best of the world. So I'm very proud to be here, and thanks a lot to give me this prize. And a few last words. I want to say a few words for the young generation of photographers. They are very, very good, but there are a lot. Somewhere too many. I keep it. No, never give up, of course. But so it's no. More seriously, it's one thing they don't know. People who never go to a front line, to a war, to a conflict, they have no idea about what they could have in their mind. But of course, everybody have lost friends, or some friends are wounded, have been wounded. So that's awful, of course. But there is something that they have no idea. It's there is many things we saw, and we never can speak about that. We never can describe with no words, or we can do the pictures, and we keep it in us only, in our stomach, in our heart, or in our mind. And that's something you can see from outside. So they must understand that with years and years and years, it's growing up, and it's very hard to live with that. So they must know that. They must take care about that. Psychologically, war is very, very difficult. And at last, I'm still here, it's because my family, and I want to say thanks to my family. And once word, you use it, and thanks a lot, because this is really the truth. This is the dignity. That's why I'm still here working on a conflict. It's because always I'm trying to work with dignity with the people I do in photography. You must to have always respect with the people you work for or you should. Okay, so thanks a lot for the dignity and thanks a lot for the prize. I'm very happy to be here.
Eric, thank you very much, and thank you for your generous words about British journalism. We aspire, but we don't always deliver. But sometimes we do, and tonight I think represents a really remarkable run of very, very special achievement and very, very special shedding of light on very dark places. And it's a great honour, certainly for me, and I think probably for all of us, to have witnessed those people who've been nominated tonight. And indeed, the whole entry this year was spectacular, quite extraordinary. So now that concludes the Frontline Awards. But this is also a very special evening because this is the inaugural moment of the first Richard Beeston bursary. And here to deal with the proceedings and to make the nomination or the announcement, I'm honoured, to find him alive at the front row, and looks in at one piece. I actually Googled him today to have a look at how bad he looked. I had to remind myself what he looked when he came out. And so it's my great honour to introduce Anthony Lloyd. Thank you.
I will. I'll try. Good evening, everybody. And first of all, I really want to thank Frontline for hosting us tonight to launch the first Richard Beeston Bursary Awards. I'm profoundly grateful. It's a great award system, and I want to talk, before I give the awards, just a little bit about Richard Beeston, who some of you will know and many won't know. Richard was an outstanding foreign correspondent for the Times and our foreign editor as well until his death last year. He was an utterly exceptional man, both as a friend and a father and a husband, and particularly as an editor. As well as being a true professional, he knew the essential thing in life, which was when to work hard and go the extra mile and when to kick back and have some fun. And I think for all of us who knew him well, and especially for those who worked for him, we recognised our good fortune in knowing him and in working for him. He wore his editorship, which I think he saw as command, and many of us agreed with him, very lightly, and with great panache and style. And he could inspire great fortitude in those who worked for him, because we always knew that he would never ask us to do anything that he wouldn't do himself. He was very good-humoured and a quintessential gentleman. I remember the last time I saw him when I went to make breakfast for him a few days before he died. And he opened the door, and it was quite a sight at that stage. He was attached with his tubes to a big tank, oxygen tank. And I don't think I looked taken back when I opened the door and saw him, but the first thing he said is, "Hi, Ant. I hope I don't frighten you, looking like this." And it was such a beautiful thing to say. His first reaction, with death quite close, was to say to his friend, "I hope I don't frighten you, looking like this." He wasn't afraid to kick ass either, and if you were the correspondent who abandoned your local staff because you were in a flux of fear, as happened to a couple of individuals, then you would spend little time before Richard's admonishment came down in the most searing and cutting terms, and you went back to your post, and nor was he afraid to push back against senior editors who were slightly wide of the mark too, in the way that they were expecting too much or too little of correspondence. So all in all, an outstanding man, And we were all very proud of him. We loved him and we loved working for him. And I know that his wife, Natasha, Jack and Georgie, and Dickie, his father, who are all here tonight, were not only as proud of him as we were, but know how proud we were of him. He died of cancer last year, soon after his 50th birthday. He began journalism, and after short stints as an apprentice reporter, as a very young man, he moved to Beirut at the height of the civil war in 1984, just 21, to work for the Daily Star. Thus began a lifelong fascination with Lebanon and the Middle East in general. Forced back to London by the spate of kidnapping of foreigners at the time, Richard joined the Times in 1986 and worked for the paper for the rest of his life. He was one of the first reporters in Halabja in Kurdistan in 1988 after Saddam Hussein's gas attack, and covered the bombing of Baghdad during the First Gulf War. He was posted to Jerusalem as Middle East correspondent in 1991 and became the Moscow bureau chief for the Times shortly afterwards in 1994 during the start of the First Chechen War. His return to London shortly preceded 9/11, and a decade of reporting from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan followed. Richard became our foreign editor in 2008, shortly after being diagnosed with cancer, and he reported from Afghanistan and Israel in the months running up to his death. So we're all very, very bereft and still miss him hugely. And the idea for the bursary came about. It was designed indeed. It's two steps. It takes on board, first of all, an incoming journalist who has worked abroad and whose experience previously is either in the West Bank or Israel or Lebanon, for a fellowship with the Times and a placement for 6 weeks working for the foreign desk. And also the bursary goes to an aspiring foreign correspondent to work abroad for a 6 weeks period on a project for the Times. And it's born out of Richard's passionate belief that good journalists are not forged in the newsroom, but made in the field. He loved to mentor aspiring young foreign correspondents and to give them the opportunity to develop their reporting and writing skills by working on fast-breaking news stories. He cared deeply, may I add, about the Middle East, and the fact that both the Iraqi and Israeli ambassadors sat side by side at his memorial service is testament to the even-handed nature of his reporting. So, without further ado, I don't think I've got any envelopes, and I do know. I do know who's won. First of all, the bursary award for the outward bound aspiring foreign correspondent goes to Ayman Agana. I'm going to say a little bit about you before giving you the mic. London-born Ayman is a 29-year-old journalist and photographer who specialises in the Middle East, half British and half Iraqi. He now lives in Istanbul. After earning an MA in International Relations and Middle Eastern Studies from the University of St Andrews, Ayman worked for the Daily Star in Lebanon, just as Richard had done, before leaving to study journalism at Columbia. He moved to Iraq in 2009 to begin working as a freelance journalist and has since covered much of the Arab world. His stories, photographs and videos have appeared in many publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, The Guardian? The Guardian. Just shitting me. What's with that? The Sunday Telegraph, Newsweek, Vice and Al Jazeera. He's proud to be a founding member of the Frontline Freelance Register, dedicated to protecting and uniting freelancers reporting in foreign countries and conflict zones. Ayman's range of experience, multimedia skills and instinctive understanding of what makes a good story both visually and in print impressed the judges amidst very stiff competition. May I say that, being part of the panel, there were from a great wide field of entries, there were only very, very few who quickly became on the shortlist, and Ayman was always a lead horse. His interest in the Middle East and focus on Iraq makes him the perfect recipient of the first outward bound Richard Beeston bursary. Do you want to say a word quickly? Just a reminder.
This is a huge honour. Thank you very much. I never knew Rick Beeston, but I knew of him. He was known for his idealism, generosity, and courage, which are very good things to be known for. 2014 was a bad year for journalists. Our friends and colleagues have been imprisoned, our friends and colleagues have been tortured, our friends and colleagues have been killed. All for the simple reason they tried to tell other people's stories. Stories that they saw as more important than their own. Stories of war, of oppression, of pestilence. Make no mistake, we are living in very dark times, but light travels fastest through the darkness, and light will continue to spread as long as we continue, like Rick, to be idealistic, generous, and courageous. We have to be idealistic because the world has grown very cynical. And a cynical world needs to be reminded that there are still good things worth believing in. We have to be generous because our colleagues, particularly freelancers, will always need our support. And we have to be courageous because in the end, the stories that we tell do have value. And no drug cartel, dictatorship, or knife-wielding dickhead will ever prevent us from telling them. I'm incredibly honoured to get this. I'd really like to thank Natasha and everyone at the board for giving this to me. I won't let you down. I'm going to try and do good work in Rick's name. Thank you very much.
Now, the second and equally vital part of the bursary goes to the incoming journalist, and in this case, I'm delighted to say that the winner is Abir Ayoub. She's not here tonight with us, but we wish that she could have been. And I hope that one day she'll see this and know how sad we are that she's not here, but she will be soon. Gaza City-born Abir is 27 years old. Having received a BA in English Literature from the Islamic University of Gaza in 2010, she began her career as a human rights consultant at Human Rights Watch the following year. Since 2012, she's been working as a journalist based in Gaza for Haaretz newspaper, Al Monitor, and freelancing for other international media outlets, including The Guardian, The Guardian, Guardian and The Mirror. Over the past year, she's been working part-time as a researcher for Gisha, the Legal Center for Palestinian Freedom of Movement, an Israeli NGO, and studying Hebrew, as well as working towards a master's degree in international relations. Abir impressed the judges with her ambition, open-mindedness, and hunger for experience. In particular, we were struck by her statement that while she'd been working for 3 years as a journalist in Gaza, she has yet to be exposed to a different atmosphere or a different kind of news reporting other than conflict coverage. The Richard Beeson Bursary will allow her to broaden her experience by working at the Times in London. We're only sorry she can't be with us tonight. So, big hand please for Abir.
Well, the final moment tonight is the Tribute Award. And this year, the judges have decided to give the Tribute Award to freelance journalists James Foley and Stephen Sotloff. Now, the judges said it is meaningful and appropriate for Frontline Club members to pay homage and give tribute to two colleagues who were kidnapped, held hostage for years, and displayed huge dignity and courage before they were executed cruelly and publicly. Freelance journalism is a noble and essential part of the media profession with great traditions, great history, especially during times of war. By paying tribute to James Foley and Stephen Sotloff, we celebrate them and salute the creed that is freelance journalism at a time when many in and outside the media are questioning its right to exist. We now have a video message from Diane and John Foley. And before you roll it, let me just say that I've had the privilege of talking to them. They are the most remarkable and resilient couple. Here's their video to us tonight.
We are here to thank the Frontline Club for honoring James and Stephen for their dedication to bring home the untold stories of those people in Syria fighting for their freedom.
We are so grateful. Jim has the deepest respect for his fellow journalists in the UK and all over the world. I mean, you were his community. So he would be so honored. And I know Stephen's family feels the same. So we only wish that we could have been with you. But we know that Jim is with you. So we thank you.
Now, whether we in this room be freelancers or staff, none of us could do our job without the fixers. All of us are dependent on the local. None of us can function without their language, their access, their understanding of where they live, their understanding of the conflict, of the difficulty, of the challenges that they live in their everyday lives. They are an absolute essential, and too often they're forgotten when it comes to praise. And so tonight, please, if you have the opportunity, please give generously to the Fixers Fund, which is a unique Frontline Club contribution to that community that we are. I admit I'm not a freelancer myself. I have the great honour to be attached to an element, a fine element, a great honour. But what I would really like to say more than anything else tonight in concluding this, that we have witnessed and celebrated the cream of our cream. And I hope all of us will remember what they've written, what they've said, what they've filmed, and what they've photographed. They're images that will accompany us through history. And history is made by these people. And the understanding of the lives we must live, the responsibilities we have, each to the other, are very much informed by their work. And so I'd just like to thank everybody for being with us. I'd like to thank Vaughan and his team for a really remarkable series of awards tonight. And to the award winners, thank you for travelling. Thank you for being here. It's lovely to be with you. And we're now getting a chance to mix and talk to them, be with them, and, you know, even perhaps imbibe one of the sponsors' contributions. What better contribution for sponsorship could a hack wish for? Got a camera, a phone, and some booze.